Welcome to Frosted Glass in Unreal Engine. In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of the assets that are included in this asset pack. I'm also going to show you some of the examples, some moving pictures from the scenes that you've seen on the product page. We're going to look at this scene right here, this residential house. And yeah, I'm going to show you the showcase level as well, give you some explanations and how you can learn more. So let's get into it. We start off by just looking at the scene. Just want to show you some pictures in motion. That way you can see it's all working fine. And you get a little bit more information than just looking at static pictures. So this is kind of the material here applied to this glass surface with a kind of mask where it's not all the way frosted, but it has these kind of gaps in between, just to make it a bit more interesting. And so this is the kind of main setup for the material. The material instances you will be working with, they look like this. They have all these kind of settings. They all have kind of descriptions, what they do. So you can read that and understand what's going on. But for now, I'm just going to play around with some of these values and just to be able to see how that kind of affects the scene. So the scattering intensity is what determines how blurry, how frosted the surface kind of looks. So I can make this a lot more subtle if I want to, and that way I can see a lot more of what's kind of behind the frosted sections there. If that look is desired. If not, I can just crank this back up and then it kind of looks a bit more opaque. It still uses the color information from behind, obviously, but just a bit more opaque. And so this is kind of freely configurable by you. It doesn't have any performance impact, although you might find that with higher values you might want to increase the quality here, which is set quite high in this case. I can lower that and I can bring that down to like a very low number, and then you will start to see a little bit more noise. And that's kind of the trade-off that you want to make when you tweak this value. How much noise do you want? How much smoothness do you want versus what's the performance budget that's available to you. And that is basically tweakable. You can see in this case I can leave it at 2 or even 1, and that looks fine for me. I actually like a little bit of noise in there because sometimes with frosted glass in real life there's also a bit of kind of this noisy look to it. So I actually like that. I'm gonna leave it at 2. And so yeah, that would be kind of one example of how this can be used. Another thing that I like to point out is you can see how the marble texture on this tile behind the glass, it has it's sharp right up against the glass, but then it kind of blurs out more gradually, right? And that's an effect that you can enable here. It's this depth aware scattering, and that basically respects how deep behind the glass are these surfaces that are going to be blurred out, and that just gives it a little bit of a nicer quality to it, a little bit more realism to it, and it can really help. And I've also given a little bit of a tint on this glass right here, and just kind of simulate a little bit of thickness. And yeah, so that would be one example. And we can look at another example that's also in this level right here. And there will be this cabinet. It has a little bit more of a textured glass to it. And so you can see the reflection is kind of being scattered up, and as well as everything that's kind of behind the glass. And again, you can see it respects the depth here where this wooden board is right up against the glass, and you can see it's pretty sharp. And the things that are further inside are kind of really blurred out, and it just kind of supports the whole depth. All right, so I'm going to leave that there. There's a lot more examples I can show maybe another time, but let's get moving on the actual structure of these assets here. So I'm just going to blank this out for a second, and then we can just focus on the content browser for a minute. So this is how the materials are set up. Right here you find all these kind of materials, and they're just basically different versions that I will talk a little bit more about once we get into the material instances and all that. One thing I will call out is the simple frosted glass material, which is a very simple material that just has a few nodes, and this is where the magic happens. But this would kind of be the simplest setup. And if you have an existing glass material, you can just integrate this one node, and then you will be off, good to go. But let's go back and look at the more interesting stuff. So here's some material functions, and this basically is just needed for the internal workings. And this material function is basically an example implementation of a complex glass material. So you saw the simple one just now, and this is the complex one, which this one respects some changes for mobile rendering, desktop rendering obviously as well, and just has all those features that we saw when I was tweaking the material instance in the house example there. So now let's talk about kind of the structure of the materials. We have frosted glass materials, we have glass materials, and we have post-process materials. The frosted glass materials is kind of one category where it's just a surface material, like any other material, you just throw it on a mesh and it works. And then these two, they work together. So you have the ability to create the kind of blurring effect on a surface or on a post-process volume basis. And the post-process just needs some surface to work. So I have included some glass. This is basically regular glass materials. There's no frosting, no blurring, no nothing special. It just uses the same feature set, so they are comparable. But so let's look at the frosted glass materials here. And this is basically just a lot of material instances. And they all inherit from this first one, which is kind of a material instance just from the master material here and has nothing else set up. That way you have kind of one master instance where you can set the quality or like more global settings like that. And all the others will be impacted by that. So these are just basically different material versions that are pre-configured for different effects. And these are showcased in the showcase level. Basically same thing here, except these are not doing the blurring. And then the post-processing materials, this one's a bit more simple. It's really just the kind of blurring effect, the light scattering effect. And that way, basically, this option number 2, where you don't use these surface materials, is basically to separate the glass rendering from the actual scattering effect, the blurring effect, the frosting effect. And so let's look at the showcase level. And it comes in 2 versions. One is for static lighting, or dynamic lighting in this case, and static lighting here. And just depending on what your project setup is, if you use fully dynamic lighting, obviously you want to use the dynamic one. And for static, you can just use this one. Just make sure to build the reflections, and then you're good to go. There's some notes here in terms of what the feature set is that is supported by this version, and some notes on how you make sure the lighting is set up correctly. And other than that, you have all these examples here, and they all have a note next to them where it makes sense. Some of them are really quite simple, so there's no note, but they basically explain what's special about these and if there's something you need to pay attention to. So just make sure to read them, and then you'll be good to go. And so here I can kind of showcase the 2 different versions. Let me just show you the dynamic lighting version as well. Some different notes here, make sure to read those as well. But other than that, it's pretty much the same thing. And so the big difference between the surface implementation versus the post-process implementation is that the rendering of translucency behind your frosted glass. That is something that is not supported by the surface materials. They can only have opaque stuff behind them or masked stuff behind them. And but the post-process version can have translucent objects behind them. Like you can see here, I have these glass cubes and glass sphere behind this frosted glass, and it renders out nicely. No issues whatsoever. And that is something that the post-process version provides. And I can kind of showcase you that as well. If I go here and I just disable the post-process material, which does kind of the frosting effect. You can see I have my regular glass now, I have a nice reflection. It's just a standard kind of glass material. And as soon as I put on the post-process material, which is happening in the post-process volumes here, these kind of correspond to these different volumes here. That's where the frosting comes from. So if you have a pre-existing glass material, all you have to do really is to put the post-process material on, and then you just want to make sure to enable the custom depth, and also enter a stencil value that's bigger than 0. So in this case I choose 1, and then that works. That might just be a convenient way to do that for you if you have an existing scene. And so yeah, also here are some showcase for you can use multiple layers of frosted glass. And this one can only be viewed from one side, and this one can be viewed from both sides. So if I were to go behind, that also works, no problem. But it has some other limitations that are described in the notes here. So you want to read that to understand how that works. And yeah, so that's basically it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email. It's listed on the product description page on the bottom. And I'll be happy to get in touch with you, help you out where need be. Alrighty, enjoy.